First of all, thank you guys for having me. This is awesome. I want to thank Sarah, Evanja, and Kanan Boyer, who were so gracious in both inviting me and being a great point person as we figure out all the sort of logistics that go into coming to an event like this. And yeah, like Sarah said, the talk today is called On Mother Earth and Earth Mothers, Why Environmentalism Has a Gender Problem. I put my, I guess the Twitter handle is like a thing we do now, so that's up there if you want to see my various musings on Twitter. And yeah, again, this was sort of a project that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. So I look forward to learning more about agriculture and gender issues from you. But it was one of these projects where I was at a panel and the inspiration hit. Worked on the piece over a year, and then it's resonated with a lot of folks. So that means there's sort of something in the world that this project kind of dovetailed with. So I've been an environmentalist since I was like 13 years old. I was kind of a weird teenager, probably the kind of teenager that would spend the rest of their life going to school. I skipped my prom to go attend the largest forest protest in United States history up in Northern California. So I was busy, trespassing to protest logging by Maxim Corporation in the late 90s. I also wasn't asked to prom, but that's a different story. It's for my therapist. So I would say that I've been firmly in the environmentalist camp, since I sort of developed a consciousness aside from being sort of just, part of my own family. So when I had my older daughter in 2010, I really wanted to make my approach to parenting consistent with my own environmental ethics. So I bought the cloth diapers, I pureed my own baby food, I breastfed, and at the same time I was working on a master's, transitioning to my PhD. I was teaching college courses. And as time wore on, I started to get more and more exhausted. And I related less and less to my sort of former environmental heroes, people like Michael Pollan, Mark Bittman, who chastised their readers for cooking onions any less than 30 minutes, and who characterized cooking, and I quote, "in that sweet spot where the frontier between work and play disappears in a cloud of bread flour or fragrant steam rising from a boiling kettle of wort." As Julie Gutzman has said, Michael Pollan can write his way out of a paper bag. And he's also a lovely person. I met him a few times, really nice guy. However, sure, that boundary between work and play might disappear on a lazy Sunday afternoon, but after a long day, I'm mostly trying to get something moderately healthy on the table that my kids will actually eat. And as a educated upper middle class white woman, I am the most likely demographic to be able to have the disposable income to purchase convenient foods that are also healthy and to hire outside help for domestic duties. That, of course, is mostly from other women, but that's another talk. And I started to feel torn as I sort of walked further down this path between my environmental values and my environmental identity and wanting to be sort of a part of this affinity group that I'd felt a part of for so long, and my identity as a feminist to be able to make decisions about how I live my own life rather than have Michael Pollan basically make them for me. So we as a society do much less housework than we have historically. And men, admittedly, are increasing their domestic duties. In the late 1960s, women spent approximately 28 hours per week on housework. And by 2011, they averaged 15. At the same time, other responsibilities have increased. There are more single-parent households. Many people hold more than one job, commute further than they ever have, and work irregular hours. There are also increasingly unrealistic expectations about modern parenthood looks like. I think anyone with a Pinterest account knows that. So the irony, right, that really sort of prompted me to write this piece was that at a time that we as a society are the very most liberated from the drudgery of household labor, prominent environmentalists, prominent lifestyle environmentalists are advocating that we return to these labor-intensive practices of yesterday. And whether we like it or not, these tasks stubbornly remain the domain of women. For lower-class women and women in the developing world, the burden is even greater. So my question is as such: what would environmentalism look like if it really took feminism seriously? So what you may be thinking now is that there is a long literature that looks at the relationship between gender and the environment. And you are correct. From Rachel Carson onwards, strong and independent women have featured prominently within the environmental movement, from Lois Gibbs to Erin Brockovich to Karen Silkwood. And women have historically made up the vast majority of mainstream environmental group membership. On the other hand, men have historically had a different role in the environmental movement. And keep in mind that I'm talking about narratives, not necessarily individuals. We've got wilderness being discovered by strapping white men like Lewis and Clark and Daniel Boone. And then we have Henry David Thoreau, Edward Abbey, Yvonne Chouinard, Dave Foreman, who sort of further this myth, right, of wilderness as being a place where men discover, describe, decamp to, and then defend. Women, on the other hand, are cast as caretakers and nurturers, right, of their families, of their communities, and then by extension of the earth. This is not universal, like I said, but within this dominant narrative, women, instead of seeking out nature degradation, or the degradation of the environment, is coming to them. It happens to them in place. At the same time, the expertise of women regarding environmental degradation has historically been discounted by experts. You know, famously, the concerns about Love Canal, the subdivision in New York that was affected by the chemical waste site, was trivialized because the uproar was caused by hysterical housewives. And then we have ecofeminism, a whole field of study that is devoted to looking at the relationship between women and the environment. From the 1970s onwards, theorists like Carolyn Merchant, people like Karen Warman, have suggested that women, because they are more likely to have been subject to other forms of oppression, are more aware of environmental injustices. They're just more tuned to be aware of them. Women are more likely to be poor and disenfranchised, thus are more likely to be on the receiving end of environmental impacts. And they're more likely to be caretakers, and thus more sensitized to environmental health concerns for themselves and their families. This is a good vein of scholarly research. This is not as problematic as the type of biological determinism that's invoked by a small minority of ecofeminists, who argue that women are more connected to the earth because of their biological systems, things like menstruation, reproductive capacity, and their sort of mystical connectedness with Mother Earth. In this framing, women lack agency over their bodies and are at the mercy of biological systems beyond their control, right? The gendering of environmental discourse is even projected onto the earth itself, if you want to see how these things are conflated. The term Mother Earth is a part of common rhetoric. Mother Earth, of course, is nurturing, provides, cleans up when humans make a mess, but occasionally acts out when humans err too much. I kind of went down the rabbit hole looking at the roots of this metaphor. It's rooted in Native American tradition and originally attributed to the word of a Navajo tribe member. The quote was, "Shall I take a knife and tear my mother's bosom? Shall I dig under her skin for bones?" But despite sort of the widespread acceptance of the term in both Native circles and beyond, there is little factual basis for this Mother Earth myth. So we don't actually really know how it emerged. But it's sort of striking the degree to which the characteristics attributed to this Earth Mother, are conflated with stereotypical notions of what femininity is and what femininity looks like. Let's see. We're gonna skip this slide. So this also dovetails with a long-standing characterization of the opposition between the home and the garden, which are often characterized as feminine spaces, and the workplace, which is typically a masculine space. All the pressures of the workforce are counteracted by the non-economic space of the home and the garden. So men go out into the economic world, while female-gendered spaces are expected to be everything that capitalism isn't. In both the developed and the developing world, women are expected to eschew these life-saving technological solutions and being sort of concerned about the world of petty wage-based labor in favor of actions that prioritize the environment. And what this does is disproportionately burden women with putting aside other priorities in order to save the earth. This, of course, is also connected to the long-standing attachment of environmental groups to the idea of the natural. The historic roots of this obsession are very well documented. It persists in the sort of degrowth, small is beautiful rhetoric of Greens like Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben. In this view, any sort of intrusion into nature is seen as undesirable, and it provides a really convenient default ethical position when faced with difficult choices, right? Just choose the natural over the artificial, and we're all good. The problem is that, well, this runs counter to history, where development and economic security increase pro-environmental values and outcomes. You know, we don't want to oversimplify and just look at Maslow's pyramid, but once people, you know, stop being hungry, they tend to care more about preserving and prioritizing the environment over economic concerns. And ironically, in the developed world, where the bulk of this sort of degrowth rhetoric emerges from, is responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions. So this nature is better formula and the romanticization of domesticity is untainted by capitalism allow these larger systems in which women and the environment are embedded to largely escape scrutiny. I'll go to the, well, let's go to this. Big, scary graphics. So since a lot of what lifestyle greens are doing, essentially, is to ask people to spend more time eschewing quick fixes in the name of the environment, I want to stop and talk about work for a second. Because we talk a lot, I mean, I think the relationship between paid and unpaid labor is a critical component of what we're talking about today. What is work? Any ideas? What's work? Yes?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's being paid for doing something, which is what we really think work is. On the other hand, it's doing something, you might say constructive, not necessarily with pay.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of tension between those two definitions.
I agree. Anyone else? Yes?
I have a question. Does this include like emotional labor?
Ooh, good question. Well, there's no right definition. I made up a definition, but I'm not necessarily right. If it did or didn't, would that change your definition?
I mean, possibly, because that's not very tangible.
It is. It's a difficult one to imagine. So you're allowed to do this once you get your doctorate. You can make stuff up. And people think you're right. But I made up a definition when I was teaching economic geography. And what my definition was that work is something that if you didn't do it yourself, you would have to pay someone else to do it. So it's both paid labor, but like, you know, if someone, me or my husband, don't want to fold the laundry, right, we got to hire someone else to do it. If it's the weekend and I'm supposed to go for a hike and I don't feel like it, I don't have to hire someone to go on that hike for me, right? So that's sort of how I define unpaid labor. And there's been a lot of calculations, work. And that's sort of how I make sense of the unpaid labor thing. So if we actually monetize that unpaid labor that was happening, what would be the implications for the people doing that labor? So I want to show this graphic twice. Woo. So this is a chart showing the amount of unpaid labor done in minutes per day by country and by gender. This is like what not to do, right? This is a small graphic from a far distance. But what I just want to show is that in no country globally is it even really close between the degree to which sort of men and women are performing the vast majority of unpaid labor. There just isn't even a competition, except Denmark and Sweden seem to be doing relatively good. Although you can see that even there, it's nearly an hour per day difference. So there's also this argument that you might make here, maybe not in this room, but there's the argument out there, that men and women are just sort of biologically disposed to do different kinds of work, right? Men are stronger, so they work in construction. Women are detail-oriented, so they're better seamstresses. But this breaks down pretty quickly, right? Men are typically seen as being a typical tailor, right, which is very detail-oriented work. Male electrical engineers, female teachers. I mean, when you actually look at the jobs people are doing, this sort of strength versus detail orientation that people do to sort of justify this division really doesn't work so well. In short, these jobs are constructed, right, socially as masculine or feminine. And with minor exceptions, there's no reasons anyone can't do this task. And again, as men are increasingly doing more household labor, this is kind of the chart I like to do to say, let's bring Michael Pollan down to earth a little bit. Sure, anyone can be in the kitchen, but who actually is? And this naturalization of women's domestic work under sort of a biologically determined guise has persisted. If you can let me digress a little bit, because I am a geographer. But there's also a relationship between performing the bulk of unpaid labor and the type of paid labor that someone engages in. And this, again, I think this has to do with geography, because if you're looking at something from the perspective of your field, it all can be explained by your field. But the home, right, is the hub from which much of this unpaid labor takes place. Groceries are unloaded at home, school pickups and drop-offs are located in the proximate neighborhood, as are doctor's appointments and dentist appointments. So not only is this close to home, but a lot of these unpaid activities do not conform to typical business hours, right? So women who perform the bulk of unpaid labor are more likely to select employment opportunities based on geography, such as commuting distance or flexibility with return to schedules, versus what matches their skill set. Further, performing unpaid labor also affects career advancement, because a lot of these types of unpaid labor take place during the time that informal knowledge is exchanged. Maybe whoever's performing that unpaid labor, say cooking dinner, is missing out on the post-work happy hour, where those sort of informal networking type of activities happen. And conferences and business trips without a spouse with a flexible job can prove nearly impossible, not impossible, but quite differently logistically for the primary caregiver. So just a little graphic as to what we're doing by type. We're not going to get into this too much right now. But you can see that shopping, care for household members and non-household members, volunteering, but the vast majority is routine housework. So that's what's constituting this unpaid labor. And so one of these tasks, of course, is cooking. We're doing, poor Michael, we're doing, he's so nice. We're doing so little home cooking now, says Michael Pollan. The family meal is truly endangered. So again, he chastises the typical household for spending a mere 27 minutes a day preparing food, and champions these increasingly time-consuming methods of food production in defense of the allegedly life-enriching experience of cooking that he fears is being lost. The issue, I think, one of his famous one-liners is to eat, how your grandparents ate, right? But correct me if I'm wrong, did he ever ask his grandmother whether or not she would go back to those days? So that was one of these things. These meals are romanticized, but they're often romanticized by people on the receiving end of those meals. And historically, once a family improves its socioeconomic status, they outsource labor-intensive activities to lower-class workers. You can see the statistic up here. According to a 1937 survey conducted by Fortune magazine, 70% of the rich, 42% of the upper middle class, 14% of the lower middle class, and 6% of the poor reported hiring some help. And today, upper middle class women who appear to be doing it all are likely reliant on some domestic help, who clean, cook, watch the kids, and then vanish from sight. So maybe before I jump into that, no, we're okay. So a partial explanation as to why environmentalism cares so much about these micro-scale personal lifestyle behaviors is that it's always been a movement that's embodied, meaning that environmentalists seek sort of consistency between their broader political views and their visible lifestyle decisions. So these decisions, these micro-scale activities, they're both a means of embodying a politics, but also identifying one's value-based affinity group out in the quote-unquote real world, right? If I've got my, no environmentalist is going to want to be friends with me once they see me carrying this around, right? I need to have my reusable water bottle, so we know that we kind of have a similar value structure, right? So a lot of these lifestyle behaviors serve as sort of advertisements to brand us as a part of a certain social group, okay? I could put that in a reusable bottle so I can make friends around here. So what are some of these things that we do for both environmental but as well as sort of lifestyle decisions? Well, making your own baby food. Lifestyle Greens advocate for going processed baby food. It has these far-flung commodity chains, uses non-local, sometimes not organic ingredients. Oh man, do I have time for this? This quote is so good. So one of these eco-mom websites, why spend your hard-earned money on less healthy store-bought foods and excessive packaging, especially when they come bloated with a carbon footprint thanks to manufacturing and long-distance shipping? Instead, serve your baby the most delicious and nutritious meals you can, food grown organically by local farmers and prepared lovingly by you. You'll be supporting your baby's health, the local community, and the environment. How wonderful is that? I just get tired of reading that sentence. Another thing is to replace disposable diapers with cloth, even though the water and the chemical intensive processes associated with producing and reusing cloth diapers make them only marginally better for the environment. With respect to birth control, there is a lot of environmental groups express concern for seeing the impacts of birth control that's dumped down the drain, its impacts on wildlife. So pretty much, a lot of environmental advocates say that it's either natural family planning or even foregoing having children altogether. Breastfeeding rates have reached a record high, due in part to scientific research showing the physical and the emotional benefits for both children and the mothers. In addition to groups like La Leche League, who advocate for the social acceptance of breastfeeding, as well as structural changes that make it easier. Nursing stations, pumping breaks provided by employers. Formula feeding is often stigmatized by these groups, the environment being one of them. Breastfeeding is an interesting one because whether or not it's inherently feminist has been debated. On one hand, it's sort of portrayed as an act of empowerment, skipping the sort of capitalist system that argues that we need these sort of prepackaged foods for our infants. On the other hand, others argue that breastfeeding is one of the only things that is still women's work. And in the absence of massive structural changes, many women are admonished, maybe not personally admonished, but certain careers are more difficult to incorporate breastfeeding and pumping into. There's also the issue of alternative transportation. So women ride bikes at 1/3 the rate of men, and this is always a problem with environmentally minded transportation planners. Sort of ironically, the bike once played a role in the women's movement in the 1890s. It was seen as sort of a cheap, accessible way to, propel your own motion under your own power. But this is a survey, again, hope it's readable. So a lot of the time, it's attributed to women's need to look presentable at work and also safety concerns, the reasons that women ride bikes at such lower rates. And you can see here this difference at the top, the third one down, darkness. You can see there's a really large discrepancy between the degree to which men and women see darkness as a barrier to bicycling. However, when we look here, where is it? The need to look or smell presentable at work, we're actually pretty comparable with men and women's, the degree to which that serves as a barrier towards biking more. The two that I want to highlight here, because they have to do with this labor, unpaid labor, the ability to carry other children or passengers, you don't need to be able to read the numbers to see the large discrepancy, and the inability to carry more stuff. So maybe what the barrier is towards women bicycling more doesn't have to do with a lack of environmental concern or a need to look pretty at work, but the fact that women are disproportionately the ones who are picking up kids from school and dropping them off, and the ones who are increasingly grocery shopping, right? And these are things that I haven't seen factored into these narratives about increasing sort of alternative transportation choices. So this isn't to argue that these actions wouldn't quantitatively improve, albeit marginally, the quality of the environment. It's that the advocates of these actions choose to ignore the ways in which they disproportionately disproportionately burden women due to the social and economic structures in which we're all embedded. So women, while they're simultaneously performing the bulk of the unpaid labor, are being asked by prominent Greens to do this in a way that's more time intensive and laborious when we have other options. So some women have rejected the sort of biological determinism associated with having a predisposition to certain types of labor. This is the French feminist theorist. She's very controversial. Elisabeth Badinter. She attacks environmentalism for being a movement dressed in the guise of a modern moral cause that worships all things natural. She goes as far to arguing that environmentalism is an attempt by conspirators to drive women out of the workplace and thus out of power. You can see her quote, "Between the protection of trees and the liberty of women, my choice is clear. Powdered milk, jars of baby food, and disposable nappies were all stages in the liberation of women." So that's one way to do it. These two things are just simply incompatible, right? And then we can't not mention the I Hate to Cook book by Peg Bracken, who was sort of the forerunner. She shopped this book around to 5 different publishers in the 1960s. It was rejected by all of them because they didn't think that, that she would want, that women would want to read a book that rejected cooking. It was finally accepted by the 6th publisher and became a bestseller. And supposedly the food coming from it was just terrible. But you can see her quote, I mean, also famously, you know, the cake mixes. Originally, when those were introduced into supermarkets in the 1950s, you only had to add water. But apparently that made their consumers feel like they weren't doing quite enough. So they added the oil and the egg. And this quote here is sort of a commentary. We don't get our creative kicks from adding eggs. We get them from painting pictures or writing amendments or possibly engaging in psychoneurochemical research, like seeing if we can replace colloids with sulfates, and we simply love ready mixes. So Elisabeth Badinter was way late to the game. Oh, I'm going too slow. So Pauling has said, you find time for what you care for. This is actually, and I believed him for a really long time. But this is when he and I broke up. This was in an interview in Cooking Light magazine, and he said, don't rush things. When sauteing onions, give them a half an hour to cook, and they'll get sweeter and more translucent, and the dish will be so much more delicious. So the interviewer then said, well, what about people who have 20 or 30 minutes on a weeknight to make dinner? Well, responded Pauling, that same person has an hour for yoga or surfing the internet. Don't even get me started with the yoga thing or the surfing the internet thing. But in stable 2-parent families, you know, maybe we are honestly choosing between yoga or surfing the internet and making a plant-based home-cooked meal. But for many households, even in affluent nations like the United States, the option for a stable and equitable domesticity isn't there. There was a great article that came out by Bowen, Elliott, and Brenton, where they interviewed a lot of different families of different socioeconomic and ethnic groups. And there was one couple that was employed by 2 different fast food restaurants 45 minutes away and rarely knew their schedules ahead of time. There was a lack of reliable public transportation. They had uncertain work hours, and this made meal planning and cooking from scratch really kind of one of the last of their concerns. Further, there's the issue of children and taste preferences, right? It's been repeatedly said that children must try a food 12 times before they like it. And on a limited budget, repeatedly offering children bell peppers is not going to be logistically or economically viable. I put that giant Guthman quote, but I want to make sure I get through all this here. So the women that Bowen and her colleagues interviewed, they mentioned that they enjoyed cooking sometimes. But just as often, they discussed the added stress, the burdens, and the trade-offs. And the women most enjoying these sort of organic, back-to-the-land foods are really the ones who have benefited the very most from industrial society. So if we step away from the developed world, the variables change. So this is related to this sort of utopian vision of the small farm as a pastoral ideal, which in many times is conjured up by people who are far removed from the realities of agrarian life, as being outside the realm of capitalism. And small farms, as you guys know better than I do, small farms in the developing world are definitely outside the realm of capitalism. Despite the fact that these small farms produce up to 80% of the food supply in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, their share of the formal market is marginal, and very few farmers earn enough to be able to escape poverty. In sub-Saharan Africa, 3/4 of malnourished children live on small farms, and women who are disproportionately employed in farm-based labor are those who suffer. At the same time, ecofeminist Vandana Shiva says, nature is the creator and source of wealth, and rural women, peasants, and tribals who live in and derive subsistence from nature have a systematic and deep knowledge of nature's processes. These third world women and their resurgence are laying the foundations for the recovery of the feminine principle in nature and society, and through it, the recovery of Earth as sustainer and provider. But this just isn't a productive narrative for women. 70% of the world's poor live and work in rural areas, mostly in subsistence agriculture, and women constitute as much as 70% of the global poor and 2/3 of the world's non-literate. The International Fund for Agricultural Development in 2011 said that the responsibilities for farming and other household responsibilities require 16-hour workdays for women in developing countries. And some have suggested that with sufficient policy support, smallholder farms maybe could generate higher incomes while reducing the demands for uncompensated labor by women and children. Another path that is evidenced in the rapid urbanization in the developing world is that many people simply just try to leave agriculture altogether. And while it's not perfect, the relative gender equity and expanded personal and professional horizons that women have attained in these Western developed economies are simply not plausible in agrarian economies. There are some incremental approaches that employ technology, empowering women while also addressing environmental concerns. I'm sure we've all heard of the GREENBELT movement established by the late Wangari Maathai. Women in rural Kenya are traditionally responsible for gathering fuel wood, which is time consuming. It reduces native color. There's native forest cover. There's the issue of smoke inhalation and back pain. And the introduction of biogas digesters really eliminated all of these problematic side effects of fuel wood collection. But what I want to bring up about this is that this wasn't purely motivated by some desire to save the forests. This is a solution that addressed female empowerment, deforestation, and economic agency simultaneously. Another option here, again, much more your expertise area than mine, but agriculture intensification, which can lead to smaller crops on smaller plots of land. Then, of course, there's grid connectivity and energy access, which would immensely improve female livelihoods, subsequently the environment. Dave Roberts was just interviewed on America Adapts, and he talked a lot about how he won't talk about population, but the one variable that shows reduction in family size is educating women. So there's so many ways in which multiple demands can be met simultaneously without focusing solely on environmental protection. Let's see. So what do we do, right? It's so much easier just to critique stuff and not come up with solutions. But what does environmentalism look like, right, when it takes women's issues seriously? I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is stop romanticizing the natural and recognize the way in which female empowerment, often through modernization, is what leads to environmental protection and to the valuation of the environment globally. This isn't new to feminism, right, who have long advocated for the fruits of these of modernization, things like birth control, which women have found to give them agency over their own lives, as well as sort of avoiding the health risks associated with unwanted pregnancies. In the developed world, the household devices of the 20th and 21st centuries, things like refrigerators, washing machines. There's a great talk by the late Hans Rosling on the power of the washing machine. It's a good one. And microwaves. They all reduced the amount of labor needed to run a household, which in turn decreased the weekly workload of the average American woman. And while domestic responsibilities, again, they still tend to burden women disproportionately, these conveniences have left women with more time for other pursuits, perhaps even pursuits like environmental advocacy. In any ways, there's really no way to get around addressing environmental concerns, the need for technology in addressing environmental concerns, without doing so on the backs of women. Leo Marx's 1964 essay, The Machine in the Garden, it argues that American pastoralism holds a contradictory relationship towards technology. And all this time later, I think we really have yet to reconcile it. And so I'm not saying that green groups are going to, there tends to be a contradictory relationship regarding technology. I don't have time to get into it. I looked at it in my dissertation, and everyone sort of seemed like, yeah, we don't like it, but it's definitely the thing we need the most to address environmental problems. So I thought, I really don't think we figured this out. But I think we need to be more creative. This book on the bottom right, Lee Phillips, he's a really interesting writer, and he sort of argues that, you know, a lot of this has to do with this implicit belief that capitalism and technology will be coupled. And he has some really interesting arguments about the way in which the state is actually one of the most radical actors technologically in terms of bringing forth, you know, the internet and the iPhone. All of these were a lot of state-funded R&D projects. All right, gonna end right on time. But to conclude, it's a short talk. Ultimately, feminism is not compatible with any type of environmentalism that idealizes poverty and neo-primitivism. Modern notions of rights, identity, and personal agency can't be reconciled with pre-modern economic, social, and political arrangements. We Greens, we glorify nature and farming, we romanticize domestic life, and we make the woman at the center of it all as responsible for being everything that capitalism is not. And this ultimately relies on nostalgia that hides the brutality of rural life and the drudgery of domestic labor under a mask of freshly cut hay and caramelizing onions. I'm never allowed to caramelize onions again in my life, if anyone catches me. So, you know, Paulin might argue that cooking is selfless and non-alienated and leisurely. And, you know, like I say, on Sunday afternoon, sure, maybe if I want to cook while my husband chases the kids and I've met all my work deadlines and I can actually relax and enjoy it. But this really doesn't differentiate between work and a hobby. And it stands in contrast, you know, to my typical experience and that of many other women who find it sort of frustrating and rushed, and I'm supposed to like it because I'm also an environmentalist. You can see the rise of meal delivery kits as sort of trying to address the best of those both worlds, which I think are fascinating. Anyway, so like I say, I think answers are harder to find than it is critique. This is a short talk, but I will end with this, and I'll say this again as a lifelong environmentalist. But an environmentalism that makes daily life harder for a certain segment of the population is not ethical. And by romanticizing unpaid labor, it disregards the burden that labor places on the populations that perform it. And ultimately, environmental change is going to be created by much, much bigger thinking than just sort of asking, you know, charismatic men, asking women, and, you know, maybe some men, to return to the kitchen or to the farm. Instead, it's going to be technological innovation and structural changes that really alter the lived realities of women in both the developed and the developing countries. And that's really, I think, what's going to be successful in meaningfully, but also equitably addressing both environmental and feminist concerns. Tons of reference.